I checked my watch, 5 minutes to 5. Heinrich and the 3 officers were already waiting for me in the street. I closed the door quietly so as not to awaken Ute and Liza. "There's no point in sinking into the quagmire of despair," announced the Hauptsturmführer. "Our oath was to Hitler, and in that respect we are different from other branches of the armed forces. Hitler is dead. I have thought the matter through. We are, so to speak, on the wrong side of the sticks. Only death and torture await us here. It seems sensible to me that we should continue to act together to find some means of crossing to the other side of the Elbe." I had realized since our retreat from the Oder that the end of our epic attempt to save Europe from the evils of Bolshevism was at hand, so the Hauptsturmführer's defeatist words, conveniently ignoring that our oath extended to superiors appointed by Hitler, did not shock me at all. Surrendering to the Russians was a poor option. We had witnessed too often the cruel fate that awaited Waffen-SS men who fell into their hands. In such precarious circumstances, the mind blocks out everything except the will to survive, and the Hauptsturmführer's decision to abandon the fight came as an immense relief to me. In a sunless dawn, I cast all thoughts of home into the woods. The world in which I had grown up was, quite suddenly, at an end. The single sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed in the distance. Perhaps someone had decided to end his or her own life. A few kilometers marching across open country brought us to the shores of the Elbe, and past the now abandoned barge where we had collected food for our charming hosts. A little farther downstream, we spotted a boat halfway across the river. Using a cable linking opposite banks, the crew American soldiers pulled the vessel towards 20 or so Wehrmacht soldiers waiting at the cable's end, on our side. The Obersturmführer cocked his MP-40 machine pistol. "Why don't they fire on the boat?" he said angrily. It was the first words he had spoken in my presence since I joined the group. Our Hauptsturmführer shook his head. "No, there will be a whole army of Americans on the other side. They can't fight them all, nor can we. If we surrendered now, it would be a chance to get across the river, to the American side," said Heinrich. Without warning of his intentions, the Hauptsturmführer took matters into his own hands and yelled, "Hello, hello! We won't fire on you," replied an American voice in perfect German. "Not unless you fire first." "We will hold our fire," replied our Hauptsturmführer through cupped hands. "Come over. I want to talk with you when we reach the riverbank," called the American. With our weapons slung over our shoulders, we made for the boat. An American officer stood at the prow, chewing gum. He introduced himself with the name Cohen. "I have a little proposition for you, gentlemen." "Is the war over?" asked young Untersturmführer Schenk impatiently. "No, but I reckon it will be in a few days," drawled the American. "You spoke of a proposition," said our Hauptsturmführer. It was an absurd situation. The war was not yet over, and here we were in possession of loaded weapons, and the enemy, only a few steps away, showed no sign of concern. "I'll take you across. I know you guys won't want to fall into the hands of the Russians. There's just one catch. I'm collecting stuff, medals, watches, rings and the like, and pistols, especially Lugers." We looked at the Hauptsturmführer for guidance. After a moment of thought, he shook his head. "Unfortunately, I cannot accept your offer, but I will leave it up to my men to decide for themselves." Only Heinrich threw in the towel. "Fuck it. I've had enough of this adventure," he declared. "I'm going over." The American officer held out a hand to steady his new passenger as he stepped on board the boat to join the Wehrmacht soldiers, whose faces wore curious expressions that managed somehow to combine dejection with relief. "Good luck, Heinrich," I called as the boat left the riverbank. "Who knows? We might meet again when all this is over," said Heinrich through a wide smile. "These Americans, what are they up to?" I asked no one in particular as we waved Heinrich a final farewell. "The captain was probably a Jew," replied the Obersturmführer, "always on the lookout to make money. A good businessman is always ready to grab an opportunity. It will be the world we must learn to live in, if we survive." Hope of finding a suitable vessel was fading when a motorboat came into view. It was in a still part of the river where a bed of tall reeds grew. We splashed through the shallow water and tried to pull the boat from the mud, but it was stuck fast. "Climb in," said our Hauptsturmführer. With the sudden prospect of escape to the west lifting our spirits, we scrambled into the boat and began to use our weight to waggle the vessel from side to side. The mud slurped and gurgled against the hull. His voice rich with optimism, the Obersturmführer called out, "Harder! It's coming free!" Plumes of water spurted around the boat. The stiff stems of reeds toppled as if mown down by an invisible blade. We jumped into the waist-deep, murky water. Somehow I managed to escape the hail of machine-gun bullets. My guardian angel had returned to my side in my time of need. Covered in mud, I came across the 3 officers a little farther downstream. "The Americans must have a deal with the Russians to stop anyone getting across the river," said Schenk. "Our friend back there was probably working on his own initiative." We continued to follow the river downstream until we emerged from a clump of willows skirting a meadow. I spotted an unlikely formation of bushes near the riverbank. The Hauptsturmführer sent me to investigate while he and the other 2 officers kept me covered from the shelter of the trees. Under a heap of foliage, I discovered a long, narrow, clinker-built boat, well varnished and equipped with a pair of oars. With the prospect of escaping across the river lifting my spirits, I made my way back to my waiting Kameraden to tell them the good news. "Well done, Usha Bartmann," said the Hauptsturmführer, "but we can't risk a daylight crossing except in an emergency. We'll guard the boat from the shelter of the trees and wait for nightfall. In the meantime, we'll split into 2 pairs, one to guard the boat, the other to return to Jericho to keep an eye open for the Russians. If they're getting too close for comfort, it would be good to get some sort of warning so they don't catch us in the middle of the river like sitting ducks." Schenk and I returned to Jericho, while the 2 higher-ranking officers remained hidden in the clump of willows to guard the boat. We intended to use the house where Liza and Uta lived as a base, until it was time to return to the river. Because we had left early that morning, I had not thanked Uta and Liza for their warm hospitality, and looked forward to the chance of rectifying that omission. Our route took us to the southern edge of Jericho, where we encountered a stream of refugees heading towards the village. "Where are you heading?" I asked a young woman who, with a heavy suitcase tied to her back, struggled to keep up with the flow of humanity as she dragged 2 exhausted children by the hand. "To the railway bridge at Tangamunda. It's lying in the river," she said. "But the word is they've managed to rig up some sort of crossing for civilians, and I don't intend to hang around waiting for the Russians to knock on my door." Away from the main street, Jericho was eerily quiet. With knuckles caked in dried mud, I knocked on the door of the girl's house. There was no reply. I turned the handle. The door was unlocked and went inside. Whimpers came from within the kitchen. "It's Irvin," I called. I heard a stool fall as the girls rushed to the kitchen door. "Oh, Irvin," sobbed Uta. "We thought the Russians had arrived." "They could take a day or 2 to reach here, but you should leave before it's too late," I said. "The Americans are already on the other side of the river. You'll be safe there." "How could we leave? Everything we have is here, and our parents have not yet returned." "Perhaps the Russians are not as bad as they say," said Uta, putting her arm around her sister's trembling shoulders. With no Russian activity to report, Schenk and I set off for the riverbank as evening approached. We were relieved to find that our boat had remained undiscovered. As we made ourselves comfortable, a cold breeze rustled in the freshly unfurled leaves of the old willows skirting the riverbank. Our Hauptsturmführer decided we should head for an SS surgery unit based in Königslutter, about 100 kilometers west of the Elbe. No one questioned his decision, and at least we had a goal to aim for. Moreover, because he had passed up the chance of crossing with the Americans, I began to suspect that he somehow harbored the hope of escaping captivity altogether. All we had to do now was to wait for nightfall. There was movement in the bushes close to the riverbank on the far side of the meadow. We slung our weapons from our shoulders and braced ourselves for a firefight. A group of around 20 figures in German uniform emerged from the undergrowth. "They might be Seydlitz troops. We'll nail them if they are," whispered the Obersturmführer. "These bastards deserve what they get. They're not wearing armbands. They're probably regular Wehrmacht," I said. The leader of the troop, a Feldwebel, spotted our boat almost immediately and quickened his pace. "Keep them covered," ordered the Hauptsturmführer as he broke from the shelter of the copse. "Don't fire," he yelled. "We're Waffen-SS, that's our boat." Every weapon in the Wehrmacht patrol's possession pointed at our Hauptsturmführer. "What unit?" called the Feldwebel. "Volk Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler," replied our Hauptsturmführer. "How many?" "3 others, 2 officers and an Unterscharführer. Show yourselves." Our Hauptsturmführer signalled for us to join him. The Feldwebel turned to his men and ordered them to lower their weapons, an act that did little to lower the tension between the two groups. We stood our ground as the Wehrmacht patrol approached. The Feldwebel's eyes narrowed. "You say it's your boat? We found it earlier today. We intend to cross the Elbe at nightfall," replied our Hauptsturmführer curtly. The Feldwebel shook his head. "So you say, but I'm commandeering the boat," he announced, "for our general." "It's our boat," said our Hauptsturmführer firmly. "I'm sorry, I have my orders," insisted the Feldwebel as he started to make towards the boat. Our Hauptsturmführer, a whole head taller, smartly stepped in front of the Feldwebel to block his progress. "I said it's our boat." Instinctively, I raised my machine pistol. Schenk and the Obersturmführer echoed my example in a desperate action to save the precious boat. The men of the Wehrmacht patrol, who outnumbered us by at least 4-1, replied in kind. We were at the focal point of a semicircle of rifles. The slightest unexpected movement could easily have triggered a deadly close-range exchange of fire. It was a tense situation, a trial of willpower. The Feldwebel stared angrily into eyes of our Hauptsturmführer, who resolutely stood his ground. A grunt of irritation broke the Feldwebel's silence. He ordered 2 of his men to fetch his general. Here we were at the end of the Reich, German confronting German, staring down the barrels of each other's weapons, waiting for something to loosen the stalemate. 20 interminable minutes later, a high-ranking Wehrmacht officer arrived with the 2 runners sent out by the Feldwebel. "Lower your weapons," he ordered his men, and turning to our Hauptsturmführer, he bellowed, "I am the superior officer here." Our Hauptsturmführer refused to flinch. The general's face reddened. "Now look here. I insist you allow my men to take that boat without further hindrance." "We will not hand it over," replied our Hauptsturmführer in an unyielding tone. The general grumbled, but eventually gave ground. "Very well," he said, shaking his head, "but I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement that would satisfy both of us." Our leader, showing no sign of retracting from his hard-line position, remained resolutely silent. "Look, we all want to get to the other side," said the general, adopting a conciliatory tone. "I'll leave 2 men with you. They'll take you to the other side and return with the boat. That way we all get across." When darkness at last embraced the river, we boarded the boat with the 2 strong-looking youngsters from the Wehrmacht unit acting as oarsmen. As we left the protection of the riverbank, an unexpectedly powerful current caught the boat. In the distance, I could now make out the wrecked railway bridge at Tangermunde. "Scheisse, we'll be in Hamburg by morning," cursed the Hauptsturmführer. "Put your backs into it," he urged our oarsmen. By the time the boat's prow scraped on the gravel on the western side of the Elbe, at the foot of a steep embankment, we had travelled several kilometres downstream. We clambered ashore and pushed the boat away from the riverbank. Whether the 2 Wehrmacht lads made it back to their general, I cannot say, but, as the current and darkness took the boat out of sight, it did not seem to me that the crew were making a determined effort to get back to the other side of the Elbe. I scrambled to the top of the steep embankment and poked my head over rim. "Verdammt! What is it?" whispered the Hauptsturmführer. "Tents, hundreds of them, and heavy artillery pieces, American probably. Guards?" I peered into the darkness. No guards. We skirted the riverbank with the Hauptsturmführer leading the way until we reached the cover of woodland a little farther downstream, then continued along a forest track. In the emerging daylight, we found that the track ran parallel to a road only 50 metres or so to our left. The whole woodland thrilled to the music of birdsong, a chorus of joy. "It's a beautiful country," said the Hauptsturmführer. Ignoring the grumbling of my empty stomach, I closed my weary eyes to listen to the sounds of spring, to nature's melodious miracle. "Volle Deckung!" cried Schenk. Instinctively I dived for cover amongst the wet undergrowth, just as an American jeep passed close to the edge of the woods. A heavy machine gun on the rear of the vehicle opened fire. Bullets zipped through the foliage, but the jeep continued towards the Elbe without slowing. "That was a close call," said the Hauptsturmführer as he brushed the dew from his uniform. "There's no point taking risks at this stage of the war. From now on we will travel only under the cloak of darkness." With the last of our food rations exhausted, we greeted the first light of a new day with empty stomachs and shivering bodies. A rickety cottage near the edge of a field seemed to offer the prospect of respite from the cold, and perhaps from hunger. As we approached, the door opened. A thin man with hollow eyes appeared. His collar-length black hair and bony face reminded me of a crow. "Now what do we have here?" scorned his croaky voice. "Well, I'll be damned. It's the Waffen-SS come to save me from—" "Cut the shit," I interrupted. "We need something to eat." The crow-faced man stepped to the side as we pushed past, then slammed the door to follow us inside. "Broth, that's all I've got to offer," said the man. "Just look at you with your medals. What good are they now? The Americans have already met up with the Russians at Storkow on the Elbe. They are dancing on the streets over the graves of Germans, and there's nothing you can do about it." He went to the oven in the corner of the miserable little room and opened the lid of a pot. "It's not exactly hot, but there's nothing else." We ate the spicy broth with relish. "How long are you staying?" inquired our resentful host. "Till nightfall," replied our Hauptsturmführer, stifling a yawn. "We'll get ourselves cleaned up, then rest till it gets dark." The man shrugged his pointed shoulders. "There's a wash basin on a stand in the bedroom, but you'll have to fetch your own water," he grumped. "You'll find the pump at the back door." "Oh, the jug on the washstand. Don't break it." I flung my camouflage jacket onto the bed, and as I emptied the last of the water from the jug into the basin, caught sight of a face looking back at me from a mirror hanging on the wall behind the washstand. 4 years had passed since I joined the Leibstandarte, but it seemed like only 4 months. The mirror told a different story. Tiredness and red bristles had added 10 years to my appearance. I slid my silver death's head ring from my finger, placing it beside a dirty glass in which a solitary toothbrush stood. As I bent forward to splash the water in my cupped hands onto my face, the crow-faced owner of the house battered on the door of the bedroom with his fists. "The Russians are coming. Your friends are waiting for you outside." It was only when we were clear of the house that we gathered our wits. "The cunning old swine," said the Hauptsturmführer. "He probably made up that story about the Russians to get rid of us." Only then did I notice that I had left my ring behind in a moment of carelessness that still causes me great irritation. Feverish with hunger, drinking from muddy streams, stumbling along forest tracks in the dead of night, we pressed onwards until we found ourselves in woodland at the northern outskirts of Königslutter, just as the sun cast its first bright rays through the leaves. The endless sheets of cloud had given way to silent blue skies, free from buzzing aircraft. The air had a summery feel. Should we remove all identification that links us with the Leibstandarte and Waffen-SS?" announced our Hauptsturmführer. In solemn silence I picked the stitches from my cuffband with my knife and for the last time gazed at the name, Adolf Hitler, written in silver thread. I hung the cuffband on the twig of a tree, close to those of my Kameraden. Nearby I buried my weapons and identity tag, and with it a youth wasted by war. The nights spent slinking past villages and trudging through woodland had left little meat on my bones, and it was with tremendous relief that I gazed at the entrance of the SS hospital overlooking Königslutter. Somehow, without map or compass, we had managed to find our goal. The Hauptsturmführer went inside while I waited at the door with Schenk and the enigmatic Obersturmführer. The Hauptsturmführer reappeared. "The war is lost," he mumbled, the enormity of the catastrophe imprinted on his face. "Germany has surrendered without condition." Eyes lowered, he turned on his heels, and we followed him into the hospital, where I caught glimpses of patients as they moved about in a side ward. Some had suffered hideous loss of flesh from their faces, while others wore grotesque masks of grafted skin. The hospital was a centre for reconstructive plastic surgery. After a nurse cleaned and bound the flesh wound in my foot, picked up when running the gauntlet of shellfire near Halbe, she showed me to a room in the hospital basement where a mattress and a couple of blankets waited. My 3 travelling companions, all officers and completely unscathed, were directed to a private room on the 1st floor. At least I was given the same food rations as the patients, and for that I was extremely grateful. On the 2nd morning, after 2 blissful nights of undisturbed sleep, a nurse visited to change the dressing on my wounds. As she finished tying the bandages, she said, "I believe you don't have a permit. Without a permit, we really shouldn't be treating you at all. We stopped accepting new patients when the end came." Not wishing to cause any problems for the hospital authorities, I asked where I could obtain such a permit. From the town hall. It must be signed by the Burgermeister. I promised to rectify the matter, and as soon as the nurse left, I dressed and made my way to the officer's room. My uniform was a disgrace. The trousers were filthy and worn through at the knees, and the tunic ripped in several places. I felt sure young Schenk would respond favourably to my request as I knocked on the door of the officer's private quarters. Dressed in pyjamas, Schenk, the only one present in the room, invited me in. I noticed there were 4 beds. Evidently they did not wish to share their space with a lowly Unterscharführer. Still, I was not annoyed with this situation. It was pleasant enough in the basement, and it would have been unbearably awkward to share a room with 3 officers who now had very little authority over me. "I agree you look a mess, Unterscharführer," said Schenk after I explained my predicament, "but I must confess I am reluctant to lend you my trousers." "But it's only for a short time," I pleaded. "What happens if you get lost? Do you want me to be left here without trousers?" Having paraded the streets dressed like a scarecrow while making my way to the SS hospital in Vienna, an experience I was determined not emulate, and sensing a weakening of Schenk's resolve, I promised, "I'll come back straight away." At last, Schenk's resistance collapsed. He went to his locker and brought his beautiful leather trousers to me. Handing them over, he said sternly, "Remember, as soon as you get back." "As soon as I get the permit," I assured the young officer. "I shouldn't be gone for more than an hour. It's not far and it's early, so I'll be the first in line at the Burgermeister's office." I left my belongings, my tattered uniform and the watch my mother had given to me as a Christmas present, in the basement and set off for town dressed in Schenk's leather trousers. My own brown SS shirt was barely visible under my pullover, and therefore unlikely to draw hostile attention. I carried my identification, my Soldbuch, tucked into the leg of my boot. It was an idyllic morning, filled all the little sounds that signify a peaceful summer's day. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the roadside trees as I turned from the hospital driveway onto the road that would take me to Königslutter. A swooping blackbird folded its wings to pass confidently between the vertical iron bars of a gate. At that instant, it was difficult to believe a vicious war that had ripped Europe asunder had just ended. I strolled downhill, barely able to contain the elation surging through every nerve in my young body. I had survived. The thump of a hand on my right shoulder brought me to a sudden halt. "SS?" A cold shiver down my spine. "Yes, Liebstandarte. You're coming with us." I said you're coming with us." The hand tugged hard. I spun round to face 3 sturdy men. On the right arm of their jackets were armbands bearing the word Hilfspolizei and the official stamp of the American military authority. "Where are you going?" "I need a permit from the Burgermeister's office to stay in the SS hospital until my wounds heal," I explained. "You won't find anyone in Burgermeister's office," chuckled my captor. "The whole place is closed. Don't you know what day it is?" I had stupidly overlooked the possibility that it was Sunday and had little option but to let them lead me to the prison in Königslutter. Around 6 o'clock that evening, my captors came to my cell. After a lengthy interrogation, they searched me and found my Soldbuch. One of my captors grunted in disgust as he opened it. He tore the picture of Hitler from inside the front cover and threw it on the ground before examining the document in minute detail. By the time my interrogation was complete, I was almost fainting through lack of food and dehydration. "Before you go," I said to my captors, "I have a question." "What is it? Am I a prisoner of war? Then I must be treated as such. You offered me nothing to eat or drink since you arrested me. It's your duty to make sure I am properly fed." The 3 Hilfspolizei left the cell without comment. In the corridor, a conversation took place, but I was unable to follow what was said. A short time later, one of my captors returned to my cell, and we conversed politely until his 2 comrades came an hour later, carrying a tray laden with food. Astonished by both the quantity and quality of the food on offer, hot soup, fresh bread, the finest salami and creamy milk, I had to restrain the urge to gorge it down as quickly as possible. My captors remained in my cell for several hours, chatting about the war and my life in Berlin. Naturally, I responded by asking questions about their own lives, and soon found out that the trio had been prisoners in the Dachau concentration camp near Munich. My inquisitors looked well fed, and I asked, "How come the 3 of you are so fat?" "It's all water," one of them said, rubbing his belly. It causes such terrible pains, sometimes I can hardly bear it. To me, his words lacked conviction. It was hard to believe that water retention because of starvation could leave men looking so healthy. The following morning, a new guard appeared at my cell door. "I need to get a permit from the Burgermeister to stay in the hospital," I complained. "And my foot wound needs a fresh dressing. When will you let me return to the hospital?" "You won't be going back there," replied the guard. The dressing on my foot grew filthier by the day, and there was a serious risk of infection setting in. I called repeatedly through the bars of the cell door for attention, but my protests went unanswered. "Where are the 3 that brought me in?" I yelled, hoping they might prove more sympathetic to my plight. "On the hunt for SS members," laughed the new guard. My days in solitary imprisonment passed slowly, and with no sign of a companion with whom I could at least have a conversation. The isolation was beginning to erode my morale. I spent most of my time dozing with thoughts of my parents and Ingeborg spinning around inside my head. The cell door crashed open. I sprang from my mattress. 6 burly American soldiers standing in the doorway came into focus, their machine pistols aimed at my chest. An officer pushed past the soldiers. "Sprechen Sie English?" "Nein, leider nicht," I answered, careful not to make any sudden movements that might provoke a nervous twitch of an American finger. The sideways jerk of the officer's head told me I was leaving the cell. In the street, 3 jeeps waited, engines running, one behind the other. A guard pushed me into the back of the rearmost vehicle while the officer sat with the driver. As we left the town, it soon became apparent that we were not heading for the SS hospital. I tried to make my disappointment clear by gestures and pleas in German, but the officer steadfastly ignored them. We travelled out of Königslutter and through wrecked villages, scenes of heavy fighting that must have taken place only days before. I could tell by the angle of the sun that we were travelling to the east, and the thought crossed my mind that I was being taken to the Elbe to be handed over to the Russians. When we reached Helmstedt, about 25 kilometres to the east of Königslutter, the jeeps pulled up at the steps leading to the entrance of a substantial building. The officer jumped from the jeep and signalled for me to follow him up the steps leading to the entrance. Once inside, my guards pulled me to a halt at the start of a long corridor with a beautiful polished marble floor. As I waited, wondering what would happen next, a mighty kick in the rear sent me crashing headlong, and I slid face down across the shiny floor. Even before my momentum was spent, strong hands twisted my shirt collar and pulled me roughly to my feet. "In there, you bastard!" sneered the guard as he pushed me into a side room where 3 American officers sat at a desk. Around the walls, hefty soldiers kept watch as the guard flung me into a seat opposite the officers, all 3 of whom had a good command of German. They fired questions at me from every direction. After a while, a second team of inquisitors continued the interview by asking exactly the same questions. It was not at all clear what they wanted to find out from me, but whenever I paused for thought, I earned a robust smack to the back of my head or a punch in the back. It gradually became clear to me that my interrogators were interested in my connection with the name Volk. It took considerable repetition to persuade them that Regiment Volk was simply a cobbled-together SS regiment based around Spreenhagen. Of course, they never explained why the name Volk had so firmly captured their imagination, but I surmised that an incident involving someone associated with that name had occurred, and they were doing their level best to hunt him down. Throughout the interrogation, I was made to stand, then to sit, an episode that brought to mind my performance in the Maskenball at Lichterfelde. The whole affair went on for hours, and my foot wound, which had begun to fester, throbbed hotly. When I brought this to the attention of my inquisitors, they simply brushed the matter aside, saying, "Later, later." When the interrogation was over, my guards escorted me to Helmstedt's nearby Rathaus, where, after further hours of questioning, they flung me unceremoniously into a small prison cell with a solitary bunk. Several hours later, my solitary confinement came to an end, when the cell door slammed behind an officer in a Wehrmacht uniform. He carried a small case and wore an armband, both emblazoned with a red cross. "Ah, at last, a doctor," I said, swinging my legs over the edge of the bunk to roll up my trouser leg. "A wound in my foot's been festering for a few days now." The officer shook his head. "Oh no, I'm a dentist, a fellow prisoner. Some chap in town denounced me as a Nazi." A single step brought him to the bunk and he sat beside me. "I was brought in to await trial and sentencing," he explained. As we exchanged stories, the door of the cell slammed behind a third prisoner, this time in civilian dress. The arrival of new prisoners went on until evening, by which time I had 11 companions, mostly soldiers, in my cell. The opening and closing of adjacent cell doors told a similar story. We waited expectantly for food and water, but as time passed it became clear that our wait was in vain. With so many men crammed into the tiny cell, which was without a toilet and evidently intended to hold just a single prisoner for only a short time, it was impossible to sleep, a further addition to our misery. By shouting from cell to cell, we established that there were over 50 prisoners crammed into neighbouring cells. Shortly after dawn, the door opened. At gunpoint, we made our way to a small enclosed yard to join the prisoners from the other cells, several of whom were high-ranking German officers. Although everyone was relieved to breathe fresh air, there were mumblings of discontent among my fellow prisoners. Many of them had been stripped of their military decorations and badges, all they had to show for years of combat and service to their country. "You have 15 minutes exercise time," announced a guard. With only 3 toilets available, it was an anxious time for those who had held on desperately until morning to relieve themselves. Somehow, everyone managed to do what was necessary before returning to his cell. Cramped together like sardines in a can, the hours passed slowly, and still there was no sign of food and water. By the time we gathered in the yard the next morning, looks of dejection tainted the pasty faces. After enduring 3 hot, uncomfortable nights of torture by cramped confinement, a Hauptmann in the adjacent cell had had enough. "I demand to see the commanding officer." He bellowed like a mad bull. "This is inhumane treatment." He banged on the door of his cell with his fists until the guards found it impossible to ignore the din. An American lieutenant appeared, but was unable to placate the raging Hauptmann. Following a heated exchange of words, the lieutenant agreed to summon his commanding officer, who, when he saw the conditions in which we were held, immediately ordered his lieutenant to organize transport to take us to a proper prison camp. When 2 trucks arrived, we gathered at the main entrance of the rat house. Once more, our Hauptmann began to raise a commotion. "We will not move another step until we have our decorations returned," he roared to shouts of approval from his fellow German prisoners. The guards swore and pushed against us in an attempt to force us down the stairs. We pushed back and refused to give way despite the threatening butts of rifles. Standing our ground, we replied with our own vehement curses. "We have been robbed, we have been robbed," we chanted. A German-speaking American officer came to our rescue. After a brief conversation with our Hauptmann, he turned to a guard. "Where are their medals?" He repeated his words in German so that we understood his intent. "In the guardroom, sir," replied the soldier. "Then go and get them. Everything. Medals, watches, insignia, everything. I will not have thieving going on right under my nose." 10 minutes passed before the guards returned with upturned German steel helmets filled to the brim with items stolen from prisoners. The Hauptmann was the first to retrieve his decoration, a Knight's Cross. Now I could understand his determination to have his award returned. The Knight's Cross was awarded only to those who had given exceptional service to the Reich. A journey of a few hours took us to a recently vacated displaced persons camp, with a boundary marked only by a low fence consisting of 2 horizontal runs of smooth wire. The Polish guards, having got wind of our imminent arrival, welcomed us with a shower of stones thrown from the perimeter fence. With smirks and taunts, they issued each of us with a thin blanket and led us to huts they had made sure were without doors, windows, or bunks. Glass wool insulation obtained from the nearby armaments production facility, the Hermann Göring Werke, covered the floor. At night, tiny needles of glass soon found their way into every crevice of my body, causing an itch that I scratched until my skin turned red, a torment worse than any infestation by lice I suffered on the Ostfront. Thankfully, a British unit took over the running of the camp, protecting us from further mischievous acts by the Poles, who continued to hang around in the hope of scrounging food. I soon struck up a friendship with a fellow Waffen-SS prisoner, who happened to act as camp interpreter. As the camp filled with ever more German prisoners, we could only stand back in horror as a fever of denial fell upon our compatriots. None of them, they declared, had ever been members of the Nazi Party. They professed their utter hatred of Hitler and those old enough vehemently denied ever voting for him. This refutation of their once unshakable loyalty to the Führer, no doubt designed to convince their captors of their innocence of the terrible crimes that the liberation of the concentration camps unearthed, culminated in a vicious vendetta against fellow prisoners. A Wehrmacht officer soon gathered a gang of followers who made it their goal to track down any Nazis in the camp. Those found to have the same surname as a high-ranking party officials such as Frank or Heydrich were hauled in front of a kangaroo court. God alone knows on what charge, and inevitably found guilty. The punishment was always death by hanging, a sentence carried out at night in the camp's boiler house. Fortunately, I was dressed in the clothes I wore when arrested in Königslutter Schenk's leather trousers, a shirt and a pullover. There was nothing to mark me out as a member of the Waffen-SS division. Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and I had kept my possession of my Soldbuch, and therefore my identity, a secret. Simply being a member of a regiment that carried the name Adolf Hitler in its title would have been irrefutable proof of my guilt, even though I was only 8 when the election took place that brought Hitler to power and had never been a member of the party. As I lay in my bunk one afternoon, listening to the soothing patter of rain on the roof of the hut, a loud shriek grabbed my attention. Ah, now who is this? Every eye in the hut focused on my Soldbuch, held aloft by a victorious hand as if it were a trophy won in a competition. A shudder ran through my body. The cold fist of fear clenched hard on my heart. Somehow my Soldbuch must have dropped from inside my trouser leg. I fought to quell any outward sign of the alarm coursing through every nerve in my body. There was a rush towards the man holding my Soldbuch. Amidst a clamour of bodies, hands feverishly grabbed at the damning evidence. In desperation, I dived through the melee and somehow managed to snatch my Soldbuch from the finder's hand. Before anyone realized what had happened, I managed to hide it inside my trouser pocket. There was a commotion as the pack hunted for it. Fortunately, the rich red beard that covered my face had masked my identity. Although the war had ended, my guardian angel had remained faithfully by my side. I am certain that if the vigilantes had known of my membership of the Leibstandarte, I would have been the next victim of the kangaroo court. Never before had I felt myself to be in such imminent danger. From then on, I lived with the fear that my membership of the Leibstandarte would be uncovered. The staged trials continued even while the British authorities investigated the murders. As is usual in such circumstances, none of those questioned knew the slightest thing that would help identify those responsible. One afternoon, as we hung about the prison yard in the sunshine, my interpreter friend called me over. "Listen carefully, Irvin," he said. "Tomorrow at about 11 a.m. there will be an announcement over the camp loudspeaker. It will ask anyone who feels themselves to be in danger from the lynch mob to gather at the main gate." "What will happen to them?" I asked. "They will be taken to another camp. For your own safety, you mustn't mention this conversation to anyone." Possessing only the clothes I stood in, there was no packing to be done the following morning, an activity that might have aroused the suspicions of the self-proclaimed Nazi hunters. After breakfast, I made certain I was never too far away from the entrance to the camp. Sure enough, a truck arrived at 11 a.m. It stood outside the compound with its engine running. A guard detail of British soldiers under the command of a captain gathered by the sentry box at the gate. Then the announcement came over the loudspeakers. I quickly made my way past the hostile eyes of my fellow Germans into the protection of the British Guard. 4 others, all Waffen-SS, also elected to take the opportunity to get out of that dangerous place. A short journey took us through a landscape heavily pockmarked with craters left by Allied bombs to the concentration camp that had recently housed the forced labour serving the Hermann Göring Werke, not far from Braunschweig. Sleeping accommodation was provided by bunks piled 6 high. We soon discovered that because of their flimsy construction, the slightest movement of a person occupying a lower bunk made the topmost bunk sway like a tree in the wind, so that any occupant was sure to suffer an attack of vertigo. Furthermore, the dormitories were located under a viaduct carrying the main road, and with the continual movement of horses and carts, it was impossible to get a good night's sleep. Still, we were safe, and because we were the first occupants of the camp, able to select the best of these uncomfortable bunks. Within a few days, another batch of Waffen-SS men arrived at the camp. I was pleasantly surprised to see Heinrich among them. How did they treat you? I asked after we exchanged greetings. Those Americans that took us over the Elbe, they had us standing chest deep in a stinking swamp for hours. He slapped my shoulder, saying, "But we made it, Irwin. We made it through to the end." After a few weeks, under the staring eyes of a guard of Poles, we helped gather the harvest from nearby fields. It was not exactly freedom, but the outdoor activity was a relief from the oppressive confinement of the camp. It was sobering to think of the thousands of workers forced to endure years of incarceration there, while they toiled for long days in the nearby armaments factories. As a reward for our efforts in the fields, the farmer prepared thin soup on top of which floated globules of melted lard. Unfortunately, our starvation-shrunk stomachs were unable to cope with such food, and the concoction soon sent us running to the side of the fields with diarrhea. After harvest time, our duties were varied and pleasant enough. We tidied the officers' beds, polished their boots, and 4 of us were allocated the task of cleaning up the officers' canteen. After carrying out this duty on several occasions, we left the canteen to find 4 plates of porridge and bread on a small table next to the entrance. One of my comrades made to eat the porridge. "Don't," I warned. "It's a trap. If they catch us stealing, who knows what will happen to us." The following day, a British officer stood by the table, again with 4 plates of porridge. "Go ahead, eat," he said with a welcoming gesture. "The food was meant for you chaps." During my time at the Braunschweig camp, I was, with one exception, treated well by the men of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Unfortunately, an exceptionally tall Scots corporal took sadistic pleasure in humiliating me in front of the other guards and prisoners. Several times, after tending to my duties in the officers' barracks, he made a point of intercepting me as I made my way across the open ground of the camp yard. "Right then, my lad," he would say, laughing. "Bend o'er and see which you think of this." I felt the thrust of something hard in my rear end. Fortunately, it was only a pistol that stabbed into my arse. Just before Christmas 1945, a British guard detail counted us into wagons that, judging by the black dust covering their floors, had recently carried coal. Looking like chimney sweeps, we disembarked from the wagons and marched to a camp standing on a hill overlooking the pleasant Belgian countryside. Ironically, the guards were ex-members of the 28th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division Wallonien, a division of Belgians that fought alongside Germans in our quest to destroy Bolshevism. On arrival at the camp, we gathered in the assembly area, where a British officer asked if there were any joiners amongst us. Well, nearly every hand went up. I suppose the men were desperate to try anything that would relieve the cold and the boredom of camp life. Next, the officer asked if there were tradesmen bakers present. Again there was a sea of hands, but the officer, having learned from his previous mistake, soon weeded out the unskilled hopefuls, and I was selected to join a small band of fellow bakers. Working in teams of 3 on 12-hour shifts, 2 men kneaded dough by hand, while the wasserman measured and added the water. My training at the Glazer Bakery now stood me in good stead. I told the wasserman to add just an extra pint of water to every 2 bags of flour, not enough for the British guards to notice, but it allowed us to bake 6 extra loaves that we were able to keep for ourselves. Occasionally a piece of fish was added to the rations, and this was cooked in the same ovens where we baked the bread. On a dismal, drizzly, dark winter's morning in January 1946, trucks took us to the harbour in Antwerp, where we boarded a trawler along with British soldiers returning home on leave. As might be expected, we were given the least comfortable accommodation, the hold at the prow of the boat, lit only by the porthole that led the anchor chain to the outside. When we left the shelter of the harbour, guards herded us onto the deck where we remained until arriving in Tilbury in total darkness, shivering and soaked to the skin. A short march took us to the rail station, where, to our utter astonishment, we boarded a train of Pullman coaches equipped with tables and chairs. After a long but luxurious rail journey, we arrived at a camp near Chepstow, where, after a good night's sleep in comfortable accommodation, we assembled for morning roll call. A sergeant then escorted small groups of wounded prisoners to a hut for a medical examination. Those of us fit enough to exercise, the wound to my ankle had finally healed, remained in the yard. "Gentlemen," said a well-spoken officer as he and his sergeant moved among us, "today we are going for a little run. Our route will take us through the town. Give the locals a chance to see what a sorry-looking bunch the Jerrys really are. As he passed between our ranks, he stopped in front of me and looked me up and down. Our eyes met. My, you do look well fed." He turned to his sergeant and laughed. "Better fed than most of the bloody locals. I spotted another 2 of these chappies earlier on today. Where are they getting the damned food?" From Chepstow, we moved to Aldershot, where we stayed for a few weeks before boarding a rickety passenger train that carried us northwards. Every now and then, the train stopped to drop off 1 or 2 coaches. At around midday, under towering white summer clouds, the train arrived at the little station in Longniddry, Scotland, where we stepped onto the platform. This must have taken the old station master by surprise, because he ran around in a panic, screaming, "The Germans are here! The SS! They'll kill us all!" With only a handful of British soldiers guarding us, we waited on the platform until around 6 p.m. before marching to Gosford Camp near Aberlady, a handsome little village overlooking the wide waters of the Firth of Forth. Despite being overcrowded, life was comfortable enough there, with a cinema providing entertainment and a football pitch offering the opportunity to take part in sporting activities. After my release in 1948, still wearing Untersturmführer Schenk's leather trousers from which I later fashioned a wallet, I settled in Edinburgh, where fate eventually had its way, and I took up my old trade as a baker.